There are two things I have protected all my life: my country and my family. The first one gave me a purpose. The second one gave me a reason to come home. If I had to choose between them, I don't know which sacrifice would have hurt more. Fortunately, life never forced me to make that choice. It only asked me to carry both, quietly and without complaint. For 20 years, I carried a secret that even my own family never fully understood. Not because I was ashamed of it, and certainly not because I was trying to deceive anyone. Some truths simply become less important as we grow older. After a while, they stop being something you talk about and become something you quietly live with. My son-in-law has never known me as anything extraordinary. To him, I have always been just an old man, a retired grandfather who wakes up before sunrise, drinks his coffee without sugar, and spends more time watering his garden than talking about himself. He has seen me repair broken cabinet doors, fall asleep in my favorite chair during baseball games, and complain when my knees ache on rainy mornings. That is the man he knows. And truthfully, I have always been grateful for that. There is a strange kind of freedom that comes with growing old. People stop expecting greatness from you. They stop asking about your past and begin assuming they already understand who you are. Most days, I prefer it that way. My daughter certainly does. She has never cared about titles or accomplishments. To her, I am simply Dad. The man who taught her how to ride a bicycle, who stayed awake during thunderstorms when she was afraid to sleep alone, and who never missed one of her birthdays, not even when life made keeping promises difficult. Watching her grow into the woman she is today has been the greatest privilege of my life. No medal I have ever received could compare to hearing her laugh across the dinner table or watching her smile when she walks through my front door. When she told me she had fallen in love, I worried the way every father worries. Not because I doubted her judgment, but because fathers understand something daughters do not. One day, another man will become the most important person in her world. And whether we admit it or not, every father quietly wonders if that man will love her enough. The first time she mentioned his name, she couldn't stop smiling. She talked about how hardworking he was, how ambitious he was, and how determined he was to build a successful future. Listening to her speak, I remember smiling to myself. She sounded exactly like her mother did all those years ago when she talked about me. That realization made me laugh more than I expected. When she finally asked if I wanted to meet him, I said yes immediately. Not because I wanted to judge him, but because I wanted to thank the man who had become the reason my daughter smiled so often. I spent far too much time wondering what I should wear that day. Fathers are funny creatures when it comes to their daughters. No matter how old we become, we always want to make a good impression when meeting the people they love. In the end, I wore what I always wear: a simple button-down shirt, an old wristwatch I've owned for years, and comfortable shoes that have probably seen better days. There was nothing remarkable about me when I opened my front door that afternoon, and perhaps that was the beginning of everything. Looking back now, I often wonder what would have happened if I had told him the truth when we first shook hands. Would anything have changed? Would he have looked at me differently? Would the years that followed have been kinder for all of us? I still don't know the answer. What I do know is this: I looked into my future son-in-law's eyes that day and made a silent promise to myself. He would know me only as the man my daughter calls Dad, nothing more. And I intended to keep that promise for the rest of my life. The first time I met my future son-in-law, I was surprised by how nervous he looked standing on my front porch. My daughter had spent weeks talking about him, but somehow she forgot to mention that he became awkward whenever he was anxious. He smiled when I opened the door, though I could tell he was trying very hard to make a good first impression. He held a small box of chocolates in one hand and flowers for my daughter in the other. Looking back now, I still remember thinking that he must have changed his shirt at least 3 times before coming over that afternoon. That thought made me smile. I shook his hand and welcomed him inside. His handshake was firm but respectful. He addressed me as Sir, which immediately told me something about the kind of home he had been raised in. Young men rarely do that anymore. Throughout dinner, I spent more time observing him than speaking. That is something I learned many years ago. People will tell you who they are if you simply give them enough time to talk. He spoke proudly about his work and his dreams for the future. He wasn't wealthy, but he was ambitious. He talked about buying his first home before turning 35 and retiring his mother someday. When he spoke about my daughter, however, something changed in his eyes. The confidence disappeared and was replaced by something much softer: love. I have lived long enough to recognize that look immediately. There are some things fathers notice without trying. The way a man looks at your daughter when she isn't paying attention tells you more than 100 conversations ever could. Throughout that evening, I caught him smiling whenever she laughed. He remembered how she liked her coffee and quietly gave her the last piece of bread before taking one for himself. They were small things, ordinary things, but fathers pay attention to ordinary things. Before dinner ended, he excused himself to help clear the table despite my daughter insisting that he didn't need to. When I thanked him, he simply smiled and said that he hoped to become part of this family someday. I remember looking over at my daughter when he said that. She was smiling in a way I had never seen before. It was the kind of smile that tells a father his little girl is no longer a little girl anymore. It should have made me sad. Instead, it made me grateful. Later that evening, after he had gone home, my daughter sat beside me on the back porch and asked me the question I had been expecting all day. "Well?" she asked nervously. "Well, what?" She laughed and rolled her eyes. "Dad, do you like him?" I pretended to think about it for a moment longer than necessary before finally smiling. "He loves you," I told her. "That's not what I asked. It's the only answer that matters." She rested her head on my shoulder the same way she had done since she was 5 years old and quietly thanked me. That night, before going to bed, I remember thinking that perhaps life had been kinder to me than I deserved. My daughter was happy. The young man she loved seemed honest, hardworking, and kind. What more could a father ask for? Of course, life has a way of teaching us that people are rarely as simple as first impressions make them seem. The years that followed would bring misunderstandings neither of us could have imagined. Not because he was cruel or selfish, but because he only knew the version of me that I allowed the world to see. And sometimes, the truths we choose to hide become the very things that change everything. At the time, however, neither of us could have imagined how important that first handshake would someday become. The years passed quietly after their wedding. Looking back now, I think those were some of the happiest years of my life. There is something deeply comforting about watching your children build lives of their own. You learn to step back and take joy in becoming a smaller part of their story. My daughter and her husband bought their first home 3 years after they were married. It wasn't large or particularly beautiful, but they loved it all the same. I still remember spending an entire Saturday helping them paint the living room walls because they couldn't afford to hire anyone at the time. By the end of the day, we were all covered in white paint and laughing at our own mistakes. I don't think I've ever seen my daughter happier than she was standing in that half-finished living room. She called it their forever home. Life, however, has a habit of changing our plans. My son-in-law worked incredibly hard. That was something I admired about him from the very beginning. He often stayed late at the office and spent weekends chasing opportunities that might provide a better future for his family. He wasn't chasing wealth for himself. He was chasing security for the people he loved. That mattered to me more than he could ever know. Over time, his career began moving faster than anyone expected. Promotions came one after another. The young man who once worried about buying his first home was suddenly discussing investments and business trips over dinner. His confidence grew alongside his success, and for many years, I was genuinely proud of him. If anyone had asked me back then whether I considered him my son, I would have answered yes without hesitation. The truth is, I never cared that we came from different worlds. Success has never impressed me nearly as much as kindness has. Perhaps that is why I never corrected him when he made assumptions about me. To him, I was simply an old retiree living a quiet life. He knew I received a pension every month, though he never asked where it came from. He knew I preferred fixing things myself instead of paying someone else to do it. He laughed whenever he saw me driving my old pickup truck, and often joked that I refused to spend money on anything made after the year 2000. He wasn't entirely wrong. There is an old saying that people spend the first half of their lives trying to acquire things, and the second half trying to realize they never needed most of them. The older I become, the more truth I find in those words. I have never needed much to be happy. A quiet morning, a good cup of coffee, hearing my daughter laugh when she calls me for no reason at all. Those things have always been enough for me. Unfortunately, simplicity can sometimes be mistaken for failure. It didn't happen overnight. Looking back now, I don't believe there was ever a moment when my son-in-law consciously decided to look down on me. It was far more subtle than that. Success changes people in ways they rarely notice themselves. First, it was harmless advice. "You should really replace that truck, Dad." Then came small suggestions. "You don't have to worry about paying for dinner anymore. Let me handle it." And later, there were comments that sounded kind on the surface but quietly carried something else beneath them. "You've worked hard enough. You should let younger people worry about important things now." He never intended to hurt me when he said those things. At least, I don't believe he did. He simply couldn't imagine that there might be parts of my life he knew absolutely nothing about. After all, how could he? I never spoke about my past. I never hung photographs on my walls or displayed old accomplishments for visitors to admire. There were no trophies sitting in glass cabinets and no stories waiting to be told over family dinners. I preferred it that way. Sometimes my daughter would smile apologetically after one of his comments and quietly change the subject. Other times I would laugh and agree with him simply because it was easier than explaining why I felt differently. People often assume silence means weakness. I have learned that silence is usually nothing more than a choice. There were moments when I considered telling him the truth. Moments when a simple conversation could have changed everything that would happen years later. But every single time, I came to the same conclusion. If a man's respect for me depends upon knowing who I used to be, then it was never truly respect to begin with. So I remained silent. And life moved on. What I didn't realize was that while I had stopped caring what the world thought about me many years ago, the people we love sometimes carry assumptions we never intended to create. By then, my son-in-law thought he understood exactly who I was. He was wrong. And soon, someone else would make sure he discovered just how wrong he had been. There is an old saying that time reveals more about people than words ever can. I have found that to be true more times than I can count throughout my life. By the time my daughter and son-in-law celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary, our family gatherings had become one of my favorite traditions. Birthdays, Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas mornings, it never mattered what brought us together, so long as we were all sitting around the same table when the evening was over. Some of my happiest memories were made in those moments. Life had been kind to my daughter. She was happy, healthy, and surrounded by people who loved her. My son-in-law's career continued to flourish, and although success had slowly changed him in ways neither of us immediately noticed, I remained proud of the man he had become. After all, people are never entirely good or entirely bad. They are simply human. That includes all of us. Around that same time, I was finally introduced to my son-in-law's father. It still surprises me sometimes that it took nearly 10 years for us to properly sit down together. Life has a funny way of keeping people apart even when they belong to the same family. He was everything I expected him to be. Quiet, thoughtful, observant. Unlike his son, he wasn't interested in talking about business or investments. He preferred listening more than speaking, a quality I have always admired in people. The first thing I noticed about him was the way he looked people directly in the eyes when they spoke. The second thing I noticed was that he rarely wasted words. Over the years, I have learned that the quietest people in a room are often the ones paying the closest attention. He reminded me of several men I had known many years ago. That realization made me like him almost immediately. Our first real conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. Surprisingly, we spoke very little about our children and instead found ourselves discussing books, history, old movies, and our favorite places to travel. He laughed when I admitted that I preferred spending my weekends fixing things around my house instead of taking expensive vacations. "You've always been that way?" he asked with a smile. "For as long as I can remember." He laughed quietly before saying something that I didn't fully understand at the time. People are rarely what they seem at first glance. I smiled politely and assumed he was speaking generally about life. Looking back now, I wonder if perhaps he was trying to tell me something much earlier than I realized. As the years passed, he and I developed an unexpected friendship. He would occasionally call me simply to ask whether I had watched a particular documentary or recommend a book he thought I might enjoy. Sometimes we would spend an hour talking about absolutely nothing important at all. They became conversations I genuinely looked forward to. Oddly enough, however, there was one thing about him that always left me wondering. He asked questions. A lot of questions. Not the kind people normally ask during polite conversations, but questions that felt strangely specific. "What did you do before retirement?" he once asked casually over coffee. "Oh, a little bit of everything," I answered with a laugh. "And where did you serve?" For the first time in our friendship, I paused before answering. "A few different places over the years." He smiled before taking another sip of his coffee. "I suppose you've seen more of the world than most people." "Perhaps." He never pushed when I avoided giving direct answers. Instead, he simply nodded as though he understood far more than I had actually said. Another time, he asked me whether I missed the people I used to work with. "Every single day," I answered honestly. That response seemed to affect him more than I expected. He sat quietly for several moments before finally saying, "I imagine some things stay with us forever." "They do." Again, he simply smiled and changed the subject. There were dozens of conversations like that over the years, Small questions followed by knowing smiles that I could never quite explain. Sometimes I found myself wondering whether he had somehow pieced together fragments of a life I had spent 2 decades quietly leaving behind. If he had, he was far too respectful to ever say so. Meanwhile, my son-in-law remained blissfully unaware of these conversations. To him, I was still the same retired old man he had known since the beginning, someone who preferred repairing broken fence posts over discussing anything remotely important. And perhaps that was exactly why none of us realized where this story was heading. The strange thing about secrets is that we spend so much time protecting them that we forget they sometimes reveal themselves in ways we never expect. Mine had remained hidden for 20 years. I believed it would remain that way forever. I was wrong. Because one rainy afternoon, several months before everything changed, my son-in-law's father asked me a question unlike any he had ever asked before. It was a simple question, yet somehow it made my heart stop for just a moment. He looked directly at me and quietly asked, "Have you ever regretted keeping such a large part of your life hidden from the people you love?" At the time, I thought he was speaking philosophically. Years later, I realized he already knew far more than I could possibly imagine. For most of my life, I have believed that family dinners should be simple. Good food, honest conversations, the people you love sitting close enough to reach across the table and refill one another's glasses without being asked. Nothing in this world has ever seemed more valuable to me than moments like those. Perhaps that is why I never imagined an ordinary family dinner would someday become the beginning of everything. It was my granddaughter's birthday that brought us all together that evening. She had just turned 8 and spent the entire afternoon proudly showing everyone the presents she had received. Like most children her age, she cared very little about where people came from or what they had accomplished in life. To her, I was simply Grandpa, the man who always carried candy in his pocket and somehow lost every board game we played together. I preferred her version of me above all the others. My daughter spent most of the evening laughing in the kitchen with her mother, while my son-in-law unsuccessfully attempted to assemble one of the toys our granddaughter had received. Watching him struggle with instructions written for 8-year-olds provided far more entertainment than anyone was willing to admit. Even his father couldn't stop laughing. For a few wonderful hours, life was exactly as I had always hoped it would be. Simple, peaceful, ordinary. Looking back now, I realize how much I miss believing that ordinary moments will last forever. Dinner was nearly ready when my son-in-law walked into the living room carrying his laptop. His company had recently secured an important business contract, and like most successful people, he enjoyed talking about the things he had worked hard to accomplish. I never minded that about him. Success should be celebrated when it has been honestly earned. Over dinner, he spoke excitedly about expanding his business over the next few years. There was something almost contagious about his enthusiasm. My daughter smiled proudly as he talked about the future they were building together. And truthfully, I was proud of him as well. "You should retire completely one day, Dad," he suddenly said while looking in my direction. "You've spent enough time working already." I smiled and laughed softly. "I'm retired enough these days." "No," he continued with a grin. "I mean really retire. Sell that old truck, stop fixing things around the house yourself, and let people take care of you for once." "It still runs perfectly fine," I replied. He laughed and shook his head. "I don't understand you sometimes. That's because I'm old." The entire table laughed at that response, and for a moment, the conversation continued as normally as it always had. Then he said something he had probably said 100 times before, without ever realizing why it bothered me slightly more each time I heard it. "You've lived a good, simple life, Dad. There's something admirable about that. Simple life." It is a funny phrase when you stop and think about it. There was no cruelty in his words, no arrogance, only assumptions. He genuinely believed he was complimenting me, and perhaps he was. After all, I have lived a simple life for many years now. I smiled and thanked him before quietly returning to my dinner. Across the table, however, someone else had become unusually quiet. His father. Over the years, I had learned to pay attention to silence. Some people speak most honestly when they say absolutely nothing at all. That evening, his father barely touched his food. He wasn't upset or uncomfortable. Instead, he seemed unusually thoughtful, watching our conversation unfold with an expression I couldn't quite understand. Several times I caught him looking toward me before quickly lowering his eyes back to his plate. At first, I thought very little of it. Then he quietly asked my son-in-law a question. "You've known him for over 10 years now?" "Almost 12, my son-in-law answered proudly. "And you know everything there is to know about him?" The question caught everyone at the table by surprise. My son-in-law laughed softly before responding, "Well, not everything, I suppose." His father smiled politely. "No one ever does." There was something strangely deliberate about the way he said those words. For reasons I still cannot explain, I suddenly felt the atmosphere in the room change ever so slightly. Only for a moment, only enough to notice. Then he turned toward me and smiled. "You've been retired for quite some time now, haven't you?" "Long enough to enjoy it," I answered jokingly. "And you've never missed it?" "Which part?" He smiled knowingly before answering. "The responsibility." For the first time that evening, I found myself hesitating before responding. Some responsibilities never really leave us. He nodded slowly, almost as though he had expected that answer. The conversation quickly moved on to other things, but I couldn't stop thinking about the strange expression on his face afterward. It wasn't curiosity, and it certainly wasn't surprise. It looked far more like confirmation. Looking back now, I should have understood what was happening long before I did. Because later that evening, just before everyone prepared to leave, his father quietly walked over to me and said something I will never forget. He smiled politely before asking, "Would you join me for dinner next Friday? There is something I've wanted to give you for a very long time." At the time, I assumed it was nothing more than an old man's invitation to share a meal with a friend. I couldn't have been more wrong. I have always believed that the older we become, the more we learn to appreciate quiet moments. There is something comforting about sitting across from an old friend with nothing more than a cup of coffee and an unhurried conversation to fill the afternoon. That was exactly what I expected when I accepted his invitation for dinner the following Friday. Nothing more. Nothing less. My daughter was visiting friends out of town that weekend, and my son-in-law was occupied with work as usual. When I mentioned that I would be having dinner with his father, neither of them thought much about it. After all, over the years, our friendship had become something entirely natural. At least, that was what I believed. The restaurant he chose was neither expensive nor particularly impressive. It was one of those quiet, family-owned places that people only discover after living in the same town for many years. He knew I preferred places where conversations were louder than the music and where no one hurried you toward the door once your meal was finished. He was already waiting when I arrived. For reasons I couldn't explain, he seemed unusually nervous that evening. "You look troubled," I joked as I sat down across from him. He laughed softly before shaking his head. "Perhaps I am." That answer surprised me more than I cared to admit. Over the years, I had never known him to become nervous over anything. We spent the first hour talking about ordinary things: the grandchildren, retirement, old books we had recently read, and the unfortunate reality that our knees seemed to predict the weather more accurately than any meteorologist these days. For a while, it felt like every other dinner we had shared together. Then, gradually, the conversation changed. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. "Of course. When was the last time someone thanked you for your service?" The question caught me completely off guard. I smiled politely before attempting to laugh it away. "That was a very long time ago." "And yet," he replied softly, "some things should never become forgotten simply because they happened long ago." For several moments, neither of us spoke another word. I had spent 20 years avoiding conversations like this one, not because they made me uncomfortable, but because I had long ago made peace with leaving that chapter of my life behind me. The world moves forward. So should we. "I've always admired that about you," he continued quietly. "You've never needed anyone to know who you were before they could respect who you are today." I found myself smiling at that. "That's because they're two different people." "No," he replied almost immediately. "I don't believe they are." For reasons I still cannot explain, hearing those words affected me more deeply than I expected. We spent another 30 minutes discussing life, family, and growing older, before he finally became unusually quiet once again. Then he slowly reached beside his chair and placed something on the table between us. An old manila envelope. I remember staring at it without immediately understanding why my heart had suddenly begun beating faster than it had only moments before. The envelope itself was nothing extraordinary. It showed signs of age along its corners, as though it had been carefully preserved for many years. My name had been written across the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. I looked up at him before quietly asking, "What's this?" For the first time since I had known him, I saw genuine emotion in his eyes. "I've been waiting a very long time to give this back to you." "Give it back?" He slowly nodded. "You don't recognize it, do you?" I looked back down at the envelope and gently shook my head. "No." He smiled sadly before leaning back in his chair. "I didn't think you would." For several moments, neither of us spoke another word. Finally, I asked the question that had been lingering in my mind since he first placed it on the table. How long have you had this? He looked down at his untouched cup of coffee, before answering so quietly that I almost didn't hear him. Almost 22 years. 22 years. I remember blinking several times, wondering whether I had somehow misunderstood what he had just said. That was impossible. He and I hadn't even known one another 22 years ago. I don't understand, I admitted honestly. You will. Then he smiled before adding something I will never forget for the rest of my life. There is something else I've been keeping for 22 years as well. What's that? He looked directly into my eyes before answering. Your secret. For the first time in more than 2 decades, I felt completely speechless. My secret. There are moments in life when time itself seems to stop moving. Moments when the world around you becomes strangely quiet despite nothing having changed at all. That was one of those moments. Because sitting across from me wasn't simply my son-in-law's father anymore. He was suddenly a man who knew far more about my life than anyone else at that dinner table ever had. And somehow, I realized I had absolutely no idea how. What he told me next would change not only my life but my son's understanding of the man he had called Dad for more than 10 years. For several moments, I simply sat there staring at the old envelope resting quietly between us. My secret. Those 2 words continued echoing in my mind long after he had spoken them. There are very few things in life capable of truly surprising me anymore. Age has a way of teaching us that nothing lasts forever, not our victories, our failures, or even our regrets. And yet, somehow, I found myself completely speechless. I looked back down at the envelope once again before finally asking the only question that mattered. How do you know? He smiled gently before folding his hands together on the table. I don't think this story belongs entirely to me to tell, he replied quietly. Then whose story is it? For several moments, he remained silent before answering. Yours. There was something strangely emotional in his voice when he spoke that single word. I had known this man for years. We had shared countless conversations over coffee and family dinners. We had laughed together, watched our grandchildren grow together, and slowly become something closer to brothers than friends. And somehow, despite all those years, I suddenly realized there was an entire conversation waiting for us that had never truly begun. He slowly pushed the envelope slightly closer to me before continuing. Do you remember the spring of 22 years ago? I smiled softly and shook my head. You'll have to be more specific than that. There have been quite a few springs in my lifetime. For the first time that evening, he laughed. Fair enough. Then his expression slowly became serious once more. Do you remember visiting Walter Reed 22 years ago? The moment those words left his mouth, the entire restaurant seemed to disappear around me. Walter Reed. There are places in life we never truly leave behind. Places that remain quietly waiting for us, regardless of how many years have passed. Hearing that name spoken aloud after so many years brought back memories I had long ago accepted would remain mine alone. I sat silently for several moments before finally nodding. Yes, I answered quietly. I remember. He smiled sadly before continuing. My older brother was there. That answer surprised me almost as much as everything else I had heard that evening. He was? He slowly nodded. He was 26 years old at the time. There was a pause before he continued speaking. He lost both of his legs serving overseas and spent nearly 14 months recovering before finally returning home. For reasons I couldn't immediately explain, I found myself leaning slightly forward in my chair. I'm sorry, I said quietly. He smiled gently before shaking his head. You don't need to apologize. Again, silence settled comfortably between us before he finally spoke the words that changed everything. He spent the last 19 years of his life talking about one person. I frowned slightly. And who was that? He smiled before pointing toward the envelope still resting on the table between us. You. I don't believe there are words capable of adequately describing what I felt in that moment. You must be mistaken. No, he answered immediately. I'm quite certain I'm not. He leaned back slightly in his chair before continuing. When my brother returned home, there were only 3 possessions he refused to let anyone touch. His wedding photograph, his military medals, and that envelope. I found myself staring silently at him once again. He told our family that one day he hoped he would have the opportunity to thank the man who changed his life. I slowly shook my head. There were thousands of men and women who sacrificed far more than I ever did. That's exactly what he used to say you would answer. That response caught me completely off guard. He smiled softly before continuing. You never remembered his name, did you? No. You remembered his face? I hesitated before smiling sadly. No. There are things people don't understand about service. Most of us never remember the moments other people spend remembering for the rest of their lives. We simply do what needs to be done and continue moving forward. He nodded knowingly before continuing his story. My brother used to tell people that somewhere in this country there was a man who had changed the course of his life and never once stopped long enough to take any credit for it. Again, I found myself speechless. He spent 19 years hoping to thank you properly someday. What happened? His smile slowly faded before he answered quietly. We lost him 3 years ago. I'm sorry. So am I. For several moments, neither of us spoke another word. Then he smiled gently before placing his hand upon the envelope one final time. The week before he passed away, he asked me to make him a promise. What promise? He looked directly into my eyes before answering. He asked me to find you. I don't know how long we sat there in silence after that. 22 years. 22 years had passed before a promise made beside a hospital bed finally found its way back to my dinner table. Perhaps life is stranger than any of us could ever imagine. Finally, I found myself asking the question I should have asked from the very beginning. If you've known all these years, I asked quietly, why haven't you ever told my son? His answer came almost immediately. Because it was never my secret to tell. At that moment, I realized why I had always respected this man so deeply. He understood something many people never do, that some truths belong to those who carry them. Then, with tears beginning to form within his tired eyes, he smiled and quietly said, tomorrow night, our entire family will be having dinner together, and I believe it's finally time for my son to meet the man I've had the privilege of knowing for all these years. There are moments in life when we are given the opportunity to reveal who we truly are. There are also moments when we are given the opportunity to remain silent. For more than 20 years, I had always chosen silence. That choice had brought me peace. I looked down at the envelope one final time before carefully placing it back into his hands. I don't think that's necessary, I said quietly. He smiled knowingly, almost as though he had expected that response before I had ever spoken the words aloud. Of course you don't. I mean it. I know. He leaned back in his chair before continuing. You've spent 20 years making sure no one ever needed to know who you were before retirement. I understand that. Then you understand why I don't want tomorrow night to become something it doesn't need to be. He smiled softly before asking, and what exactly would that be? A spectacle. He laughed quietly at my answer. You still don't understand why I'm doing this, do you? I frowned slightly before shaking my head. No, I don't believe I do. For several moments, he simply sat there smiling, before finally saying something I don't believe I will ever forget. This isn't about revealing who you used to be. It's about showing my son who you've been all along. Those words stayed with me long after our conversation had ended. Because perhaps he was right. My son-in-law had spent more than 10 years knowing me as an old retired man who preferred repairing broken things over replacing them. He knew I loved my daughter more than life itself. He knew I would happily drive 3 hours to watch my granddaughter perform in a school play that lasted less than 15 minutes. He knew I hated wasting food and refused to throw away perfectly good tools simply because newer ones existed. He knew I called him every year on his birthday before anyone else had the chance. He knew all of those things. And somehow, despite knowing all of them, he still believed he understood only a small part of who I was. Perhaps that had always been my fault. The following evening, our family gathered together once again around the same dinner table we had shared hundreds of times before. There was nothing unusual about the beginning of that evening. My granddaughter immediately began telling everyone about her plans for becoming either a veterinarian or an astronaut, depending upon which answer changed every 15 minutes. My daughter laughed as she attempted unsuccessfully to keep her from eating dessert before dinner. And my son-in-law was busy discussing an upcoming business trip he had been preparing for all week. It was ordinary, beautifully ordinary. For a brief moment, I found myself wishing time would simply stop moving forward altogether. Then his father arrived carrying the same old envelope beneath his arm. The moment I saw it resting quietly beside him, I knew there would be no changing his mind. Dinner continued peacefully for nearly an hour, before the conversation eventually found its way toward retirement once again. My son-in-law laughed as he looked toward me from across the table. You know, he said jokingly, I keep telling Dad he should finally learn how to enjoy retirement properly. And what does that look like exactly? I asked with a smile. Less working around the house and more enjoying life. I enjoy working around the house. See? He laughed while turning toward everyone else. Impossible. The entire table laughed alongside him. Then he added something that immediately brought an unexpected silence over the room. You know what I admire most about Dad? he asked proudly. What's that? My daughter smiled. He never needed much in life to be happy. No fancy titles, no extraordinary accomplishments, just family and a simple life. There was absolutely no cruelty in his words, only love. And somehow I realized that made what would happen next even more difficult than I had imagined. His father quietly placed his fork down upon his plate before finally speaking for the first time in nearly 20 minutes. I've always admired that about him as well. My son-in-law smiled warmly before nodding in agreement. He deserves all the peace retirement has given him. For several moments, his father simply sat there looking toward me before slowly reaching for the old envelope resting beside his chair. Then, without another word, he carefully placed it upon the dinner table. The entire room immediately became silent. My daughter looked confused. My granddaughter was far more interested in her mashed potatoes than whatever mysterious conversation had suddenly begun unfolding before her. And my son-in-law simply frowned in confusion. His father smiled gently before speaking. There is something I've been waiting more than 20 years to return to its rightful owner. No one spoke. He slowly turned toward his son before asking quietly, Tell me something. After 12 years, how well do you believe you know this man sitting across from you? My son-in-law smiled politely before answering, Better than almost anyone. His father slowly nodded. I used to believe that as well. For the very first time since I had met him, I watched genuine confusion begin appearing across my son-in-law's face. Then his father carefully pushed the old envelope across the dinner table until it came to rest directly in front of me, and quietly said, The problem, my son, is that you've spent 12 years knowing only the man he allowed the world to see. No one spoke for several moments after his words settled over the dinner table. I looked across at my son-in-law and immediately recognized the confusion in his eyes. He glanced toward me before looking back at his father, as though silently asking whether this was some kind of joke he simply didn't understand. My daughter seemed equally confused. Dad? She asked softly while looking toward me. What's going on? Before I could answer, his father smiled gently and shook his head. Perhaps I've waited too long to tell this story, he said quietly. But I promised someone 22 years ago that if I ever found him, I would thank him properly. He slowly pointed toward the old envelope resting before me. That promise has been waiting for this moment ever since. I found myself smiling softly before looking back down at the envelope. For 20 years, I had protected my peace by refusing to become the man I used to be again. Retirement had never felt like losing part of my identity. If anything, it had allowed me to finally become the version of myself I enjoyed being most: a father, a grandfather, and an ordinary old man living an ordinary life. And I had been perfectly happy remaining exactly that. My son-in-law looked toward me once more before speaking quietly. Dad, what is he talking about? There was no fear in his voice, only confusion. I smiled softly before answering honestly. Something that happened a very long time ago. His father gently opened the envelope before removing several old photographs and documents that had remained untouched for more than 2 decades. No one at the table spoke another word. The first photograph showed a much younger version of myself, standing beside several men whose names I still remember despite the years that had passed. Time had painted my hair gray and placed lines across my face, but there was no mistaking the man in that photograph. My daughter slowly covered her mouth with both hands. Oh my God. I laughed quietly at her reaction. I used to have more hair. That answer somehow broke the tension in the room just enough for everyone to laugh softly. Then his father removed another photograph. And another. There were photographs from places I had spent years trying not to remember too often. Some moments deserve remembering, others deserve peace. My son-in-law sat silently staring at the photographs, resting before him, as though they belonged to someone he had never met before. Because perhaps they did. Finally, his father unfolded an old newspaper clipping and quietly placed it beside the photographs. I found this among my brother's belongings after he passed away. He slowly looked toward his son before continuing. My brother used to tell us stories about a man he believed saved far more lives than he would ever allow himself to admit. I immediately shook my head. That's never how I would describe it. I know. He smiled softly. That's why he admired you so much. Again, silence settled across the room. There are moments in life when people discover something extraordinary about another person. They imagine that extraordinary thing somehow changes who that person has always been. The truth is usually much simpler than that. I was still the same man sitting at that dinner table. I still hated replacing perfectly good tools. I still drove an old truck that everyone insisted I should have sold years ago. I still lost board games to my granddaughter every single weekend. Nothing had changed. Only their understanding had. Finally, my son-in-law looked toward me once again. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" he asked quietly. There was pain in his voice that I hadn't expected to hear. I smiled before answering honestly. "Because it wasn't important." He frowned immediately. "It wasn't important?" "No." "But this is your life." I slowly nodded. "No," I answered softly. "It's part of my life." There is a difference between those two things that only age can truly teach us. We are not our accomplishments. We are not our titles. And we are certainly not the things strangers admire most about us. We are simply the people who return home afterward. For me, being a father had always mattered more than anything that happened long before my daughter was born. Nothing else ever came close. I spent most of my life wearing uniforms, I continued quietly. Retirement allowed me to become something far more important. "And what's that?" my granddaughter asked innocently. I smiled warmly before answering. "Your grandpa." The entire table laughed softly as she immediately smiled and returned to eating her dinner, completely unimpressed by everything everyone else seemed so fascinated by. Children have a wonderful way of reminding us what truly matters. Then something happened I never expected. My son-in-law quietly lowered his eyes toward the dinner table before speaking so softly that I almost didn't hear him. "I'm sorry. No apologies are necessary." "Yes," he interrupted quietly. "I think there are." For several moments, he remained silent before continuing. "I've spent 12 years believing I understood the kind of man you were." I smiled softly. And I was wrong. There was no shame in his voice, no embarrassment, only honesty. He slowly looked back toward me before continuing. "The worst part isn't discovering I didn't know who you used to be. It's realizing I didn't pay enough attention to who you've been all along. At that moment, I don't believe there was a prouder father sitting anywhere in the world. Because true character isn't revealed by never making mistakes. It's revealed by what we choose to do after discovering we've made them." Then his father quietly smiled before saying the words that would remain with me forever. "Titles fade with time. The kind of man sitting at this table tonight doesn't. Life has a peculiar way of teaching us what truly matters. When we are young, we spend our time chasing titles, accomplishments, and recognition. We imagine success as something waiting patiently for us somewhere in the future. We tell ourselves that happiness will arrive after the next promotion, the next achievement, or the next great victory. And then, if we are fortunate enough, life eventually teaches us something entirely different. It teaches us that none of those things were ever meant to last forever." That evening, after the conversation had finally settled into silence once again, I realized there was very little left that needed to be said. For more than 20 years, I had carried a secret that was never really a burden to carry. I simply believe some chapters of our lives deserve to remain quietly closed once they have reached their proper ending. I had no regrets about that decision. Not then, and certainly not now. My daughter sat quietly beside me holding one of the old photographs that had somehow survived more than 2 decades without finding its way back to me. Tears had long since begun finding their way down her face, despite her repeated attempts to smile through them. "You really never wanted us to know?" she asked softly. I smiled before gently squeezing her hand. "No." "Why?" The answer came easier than I expected. "Because I already had everything I ever wanted." She laughed softly through her tears before asking, "And what was that?" I looked around the dinner table before answering. "This." There are moments in life when the simplest answers become the truest ones. "This." Not the medals resting inside old wooden boxes somewhere in my home. Not the photographs that had somehow survived 22 years tucked carefully inside an envelope. And certainly not the rank I once held so many years ago. This family sitting around my dinner table had always mattered infinitely more than any of those things ever could. For several moments, no one spoke another word. Then my granddaughter climbed onto my lap exactly as she had done hundreds of times before and asked the single most important question anyone had asked me all evening. "Grandpa?" "Yes?" "Were you famous?" The entire table laughed immediately. I smiled before gently kissing the top of her head. "No, sweetheart." "Were you a hero?" I paused for several moments before answering honestly. "No." She frowned slightly before asking, "Then why is everyone crying?" There are questions only children can ask so beautifully. I smiled toward everyone sitting around the table before finally answering. Because sometimes people discover they already had something wonderful sitting right beside them. That answer seemed perfectly acceptable to her because she immediately smiled before asking whether we were still having dessert after dinner. Children have always understood life better than adults give them credit for. Several minutes later, my son-in-law quietly walked around the table before sitting down beside me. There were tears in his eyes that he made absolutely no effort to hide. "I'm sorry," he said quietly once again. "You've already apologized. I don't think once is enough." I laughed softly before placing my hand upon his shoulder. "Then perhaps it's a good thing we still have many years ahead of us." He smiled through his tears before asking quietly, "Can I ask you one last question?" "Of course. After everything you've done, after all these years, don't you ever wish people knew?" For several moments, I found myself thinking about the question before finally smiling. When I was younger, perhaps. And now? I looked around the room once more before answering honestly. "Now, I don't believe there's anything left for me to prove." That answer seemed to surprise him more than anything else I had said that evening. "You really mean that, don't you?" "I do. There is an extraordinary freedom that comes with growing older. Eventually, we stop worrying about whether the world remembers our accomplishments and begin caring only that the people we love remember that we love them well. Nothing else truly matters very much after that." Before leaving that evening, my son-in-law's father quietly walked beside me toward my truck. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly. "Regret what?" "Keeping your secret for 20 years. I smiled before looking back through the dining room window at my family laughing together around the dinner table. "No," I answered quietly. "Not for a single day." He smiled knowingly before asking one final question. "And if you had the opportunity to live your life over again?" My answer came immediately. "I wouldn't change a thing. Because I have learned that titles eventually fade. Photographs grow old. Even our greatest accomplishments slowly become stories that fewer and fewer people remember with each passing year. But kindness endures. Character endures. Love endures. And perhaps that is why I have never missed the man I used to be. After all these years, I have finally realized something that should have been obvious from the very beginning. I was never a 4-star general who became a father. I was simply a father fortunate enough to have once worn 4 stars upon his shoulders. And if I am remembered for anything when my own story finally reaches its end, I hope it will not be because of the rank I once held. I hope it will simply be because I loved my family well. Because after everything life has given me, there is only one title I have ever truly treasured: Grandpa. And that has always been more than enough.